Damn! Oh!
He is flying again.
While Russians queue for fuel and watch their warehouse burn, Putin has just told his government what the next 3 years will look like. Defense stays the top priority in the budget through 2029. Civilian spending gets cuts to pay for it, and the war has already cost Russian taxpayers the equivalent of nearly 3 decades of the country's healthcare budget. He is not planning for peace, he is planning for 3 more years of war.
On July 27th, Vladimir Putin told his government what the next 3 years of Russian life will look like. Military spending will remain the top priority as the Kremlin drafts its budget for 2027 through 2029, he said, while accusing the West of a Russophobic campaign and setting world records in sanctions, and insisting that nobody will ever break the Russian people. Read as rhetoric, it is the usual material. Read as a planning document, it is an admission. Putin is not preparing to end this war. He is preparing to survive it. The arithmetic explains why. Russia's 2026 budget originally set aside 12.9 trillion rubles for national defense, but actual military spending is expected to overshoot that by 4 to 5 trillion. Federal spending on the war reached 5.9 trillion rubles in the first quarter alone, according to Janis Kluges of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, an increase of almost 30% on the same period last year and 4.6 times the level of the first quarter of 2022. In total, the war has cost Russian taxpayers 53.079 trillion rubles, roughly $746 billion, a sum equivalent to 28 years of the country's current healthcare spending or 30 years of its education budget. That last comparison is the political time bomb, and Putin knows it better than anyone. As long as the war continues, those numbers are an act of patriotism, sacrifice, endurance, a nation under siege. The moment the war stops, the same numbers become a bill, itemized and unavoidable, laid on the kitchen table of a country whose hospitals, schools, and roads went unfunded to pay it. Nothing in Russia's political system is designed to absorb that question. And the bill is getting harder to hide even now. The finance ministry raised VAT to 22%, yet the federal deficit had already reached almost 6 trillion rubles by the end of the first half of the year and could widen to 7 trillion by December, according to Emil Ablayev of the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting. Bloomberg estimates the ministry is now cutting civilian spending and planning to borrow another 2 to 3 trillion rubles to cover war costs. Ablayev describes the result as a selective approach to funding everything that is not defense or security, in a system where budget revenues already fell 3 trillion rubles short of target last year. This is the trap Putin has built for himself. Wars end with accounting. Russians who currently queue for gasoline while telling themselves it is temporary would, in peacetime, start asking what exactly they queued for. Families who lost sons would want to know what the sons bought. Regional governors who explained away burning refineries and canceled parades would have nothing left to explain them with. The men who ran the war would face the one audience the Kremlin cannot manage, a domestic public with time on its hands and no external enemy to point at. So the war becomes its own justification. Putin has signed another decree expanding the armed forces by 27,000 personnel from August 1st, while officials continue to insist that no new mobilization is needed because volunteers are sufficient. Alongside defense, he promised that key social priorities would finally be addressed, a sentence that has been promised in every Russian budget cycle of this war and delivered in none of them. What Putin is really budgeting for is a miracle. Western fatigue, a collapse of Ukrainian manpower, a shift in Washington, a sanctions regime that quietly erodes, something that lets him call the ledger a victory rather than a debt. Absent that, the strategy is simply to keep going, because continuing is expensive and stopping is fatal. 3 more years is not a forecast. It is a hope that the reckoning can be postponed until someone else has to face it. You have to hear this to understand who Ukrainians are actually dealing with. A man who talks about nations the way others talk about myths and legends, and who cannot process the idea that a people might simply choose their own future. Nonsense! Complete rubbish! But they did do it. They officially made the decision that Russians in Ukraine are not the titular nation. That is his grievance. Not a border, not a treaty, a word in a law. And in the name of that word, he is feeding his own citizens into a meat grinder at a pace no Russian leader has managed since the Second World War, while telling them Ukraine is the one being punished.
There is in the western part of Ukraine a gift from Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin to Ukraine after the war. What? Stalin gifted these lands to Ukraine, but he gifted them within the framework of a single state. Apparently, it never occurred to him that a situation like today's could arise. By the way, I am sure that sooner or later Ukraine will lose these western lands. And what belonged to Poland, belonged to Hungary, belonged to Romania, sooner or later, not tomorrow, maybe not the day after, a year, 2, 10, 15, but everything will historically fall into place. There was only one guarantor of Ukraine's territorial integrity. That was Russia. But they deemed it necessary, possible, and beneficial for themselves to declare Russia their enemy and to declare Russians in Ukraine a non-titular nation, which is complete nonsense, utter rubbish. But they did it. They officially decided that Russians in Ukraine are a non-titular nation. Well, look at that. And what is that then?
Right, well, to hell with them.
And to explain why Putin's lies still hold ground in Russia, Russians, take note. A woman from Yaroslavl has come up with a spell to make drones fly past. You're flying. I'm sitting. You're flying. I'm sitting, repeats a woman terrified to death as she waits out the UAV attack. According to Russia's defense ministry, 276 UAVs were shot down over Russian regions overnight. Russia also attacked Ukraine during the night, launching 147 drones at the country.
Damn! Oh!
He is flying again.
It is flying, I'm sitting.
It is flying, I'm sitting. It is flying, I am sitting. He is still flying and I am still sitting. It flies, I sit, it flies, I sit, it flies, I sit. You're flying, I'm sitting. You're flying, I'm sitting.
You're flying, I am sitting. You fly, I sit, you fly, I sit, you fly, I sit, you fly, I sit.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe. Also, if you want to support Warthog Defense, please become our member and get early access to new videos, exclusive members-only videos, and become administrator in comments section. The membership link is in the description.
Rescues every day. We had a guy last week, it's 6 rescues in 6 days. You know, he's doing the job every day.